So I would, before Michael Borkham will introduce the webinar series, I just want to say hello to everybody as the current SPR president. I want to say that I'm so happy that we'll start this, that we will have this series coming now. And in the next, 1 year, we will have several webinars on this. And I'm happy Michael will introduce it now, and he will also introduce our speaker for today, Steve Hollon. That's just wonderful. Michael, yes.
Okay, thanks, Wolfgang. So first of all, just to give a bit of background here, the idea of this was really to disseminate all the effort and work that went into the handbook, which for those who haven't seen it, that's the handbook. And for anybody who's in any doubt, this is about $100, okay? This little piece here was half that price for 200 pages and 50 quid. This is 850 pages, hardback, and it's magnificent. So if you haven't got it, buy it. Okay, but the idea here was really to disseminate the knowledge base that's accumulated in the handbook. And just like to pay thanks to CEPI, Jeff Harris, and to APA Division 29, Melissa Jones, who are part of the body that actually sort of developed the idea of doing these webinar series in combination with SPR. So it's a kind of APA 29, CEPI, and SPR. Okay, so I think this is in itself a first, and it's great to have that kind of wider distribution. So basically, we decided that we'd have something like 10 webinars over the period of about 1 year in clutches. So we have 3 planned, the one today, then there's one in April with Simon Goldberg and Scott Baldwin, and then another one in May with Sarah Knox and Clara Hill. So there is no particular sequencing in terms of how we've organized the webinars. They're a bit of a mix and match, which will add variety and sort of a bit of novelty to the series. So we have, in other words, we haven't followed the sequence of the chapters in the book in that kind of way. Okay, so those are the ones we've agreed on, and there'll be further webinars advertised after the Dublin SPR meeting. So what that does is bring us to the event today, which I think is, for various reasons, special. I think there is a system in the US. We have a similar system here in our Houses of Parliament, where the longest continuously serving member of Parliament is called the father and respectively the mother of the House of Commons. Okay, so in that kind of tradition, hereby Steve Hollon is the father of the handbook, because he has contributed 6 continuous editions to the handbook. And I think that's just phenomenal. And for anyone who's listening, particularly if Clara Hill's listening, Clara Hill is the mother of the handbook. So basically, this felt like a kind of a very appropriate way to start off the series, following on from the earlier one that we organized where we had Alan Bergin and Mike Lambert, partly because Steve knows the handbooks series so well. And in fact, during his writing of his contribution to the most recent edition, every now and then had this wonderful interchange with Steve where he narrated how important and significant the handbook was to him in his first steps in his career. And I just think that sharing some of those personal stories is so important to furthering and conveying the tradition of SPR and the handbook in that kind of way. So this is a great kind of privilege to ask Steve to present what is in fact the inaugural webinar of the Bergin and Garfield Handbook. And for those folk who don't know Steve, I think we've got 3 in 1 here. He is the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Professor in Department of Psychology, professor of Department of Psychology and Human Development, and professor in the Department of Psychiatry. So 3 for the price of 1. It's not bad. It's better than buy one, get one free. Okay, so without further ado, can we welcome Steve, who's going to talk to the title, The Bergin and Garfield Handbook of Psychotherapy and Behavior Change, the compendium that has defined psychotherapy and its relationship with medication across the generations. Steve, the microphone's yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. Appreciate it. And folks for setting this up, that I very much appreciate. Just one note, I think if folks have questions, things they want to raise, outrage they want to express, we can do that as we go along. And I prefer to take any comments and respond to them as best we can. I'll have the presentation today set up in a series of nodes. And at the end of each node, I'll stop again and ask if there are any questions folks haven't had a chance to. Please feel free to be interactive, and we'll do the best we can with the technologies. Oops, over here. Michael's absolutely correct. I particularly tend to bring personal aspects in. And just to say, about 4 or 5 years ago, my wife's a developmental psychopathologist, and I happened to get invited to the same conference. As it turns out, our dog, Zoe the Wonder Dog, who almost had a standing appointment at the vets, had done something more recent, and she was in the she couldn't get up and down the stairs on her own, couldn't get on the sofas on her own. And I'd already had a conference in London wiped out about 2 weeks before, but by now my wife Judy could manage her, so I got to go to the second conference. But I stood in for Judy as a discussant, and I wanted a slide that would explain why it was I was there and not my wife. And this is the explanation. At the end, you'll see a little brief slide of one of our granddaughters, one of our 2 granddaughters, the oldest. And what I learned is anytime you give a talk, always open with puppies and end with babies. It just went better than anything else I've ever done. So I want to repeat that again. The Bergin and Garfield's Handbook of Psychotherapy and Behavior Change is the single preeminent compendium of what we know about psychotherapy research in the field today. I just think what Michael and Wolfgang and Louis have done with this is just absolutely amazing. And it goes all the way back to the late 60s when Alan Bergin and Saul Garfield developed the first one. They brought together the best and the brightest in psychotherapy research. This is what this is the current version of what I trained on. I'll go further on. The original is in the upper left-hand corner, the first edition. That's what I trained on as a graduate student. And I thought it just absolutely amazing. My Director of Clinical Training, Wally Kennedy, introduced it by saying, these are the top people in the field. They're writing the most interesting chapters in the field. They're dealing with the major issues in the field. And he was absolutely correct. It's the, I think it's the Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, all rolled into one when it comes to psychotherapy research. And if you'll notice in the, on each I've superimposed in yellow, just some of the authors that have shown up in the text. We got the editors down on the bottom of the lower left, people like Bandura, Isings, Kiesler, Laborsky, Patterson, and the first one, I don't mean to offend anybody that of the other major marvelous contributors that were in there that I didn't list. If you go through Gottman, Kasdan, Marx, Orlinsky and Howard, Strupp, Elkin, Lambert, Roden in the third, Butler and Greenberg in the fourth, Kendler and Sexton joined in the fifth. We've got Barber, Castengay, Kritz-Christoph, Derubis, Hill, Weiss joining in the sixth, and brings us back to the current. I'm going to get rid of this little thingy up here. Yeah, okay, I lost the pictures. The first handbook was the one I trained on, and I did not have the opportunity to contribute to that, although I trained on it. And throughout the course of the 7 editions, I've been fortunate enough to be able to contribute to one of 2 different chapters. On the left-hand side is cognitive behavior therapy, and there was no chapter on cognitive behavior therapy in the initial edition. It wasn't around. It wasn't hadn't been developed yet, so there was none. On the right-hand side is the medication, psychotherapy medications chapter, and that was done by Philip May, P.R.A. May, and it was a quite good chapter and thoughtful. He's a schizophrenia researcher at UCLA at the time. Now, I was still I went up to Philadelphia, and near the end of my graduate training, basically my now wife, then girlfriend, and I ran off to Philadelphia to cure depression. She went up, worked with Marty Seligman. I went up to work with Tim Beck. And in the midst of the 2 years we spent in Philadelphia, career defining for us, one of the places we really very much wanted to go if we could maintain a two-professional relationship was UCLA. And near the end of that time, we were making a trip out to California. We stopped at the Neuropsychiatric Institute at NPI, and I had a chance to go through the building, and I went and introduced myself to Professor May. He was very courteous, very gracious, and I indicated that I've had the great good fortune of being asked by my mentor, Tim Beck, to join him on a chapter for the second edition on psychotherapy and medications, not realizing that the reason why the offer had come to Beck is they hadn't been helped. The editors hadn't been happy with the first chapter. So May was gracious about the whole thing. We chatted about that. We talked about that. But it was one of those awkward moments that I probably shouldn't have made, but I've made repeatedly throughout my career. Back up one more second. I'm sorry. To hear this. The second edition is the one that I was able to join. You notice on the left, we now have a beginning chapter on cognitive behavior therapy. Michael Mahoney and Diane Arnkoff were the ones that generated that. And in those days, cognitive behavior therapy was largely promissory. It was something that looked like it might be a good idea. Mike Mahoney really took the lead in laying out the conceptual rationale, but there weren't many studies to talk about, and there wasn't much in the way of data, but they did a very nice job on that theoretically. On the right-hand side, Tim Beck, my mentor, got an invitation from Saul Garfield and Alan Bergin to do the chapter on psychotherapy medications for the second edition, and Tim graciously asked me to join him on that. I'd never written anything before professionally, never published anything, but I set about the task and brought back in about a 200-page first draft to give him. He looked at it and said, I'll read that through. And what he did was send it directly on to Saul Garfield. Got a lovely note back from Saul Garfield saying, I've read the chapter. It looks like there's quite a lot of useful information there. The problem is we have about 4 times as much information as we could possibly have. Can you cut it down? So we worked on that. Tim Beck shared the story at that time that although he knew both Alan Bergin and Saul Garfield, Alan Bergin, absolutely lovely man that nobody found intimidating. Saul Garfield, Tim said, always kind of scared him. And in fact, I can understand Saul Garfield, if you've never met or had never met the man, came across like a mafia don, gracious individual, couldn't have been nicer. I had a chance to overlap with him on APA committees a couple of years later on, but he carried himself in a way that looked like he could have been sitting across the table from Tony Soprano and dividing up New York with the between the 5 families. You didn't mess with Saul Garfield in those days. The third edition, we were switched over, and Tim and I got invited to do the chapter on cognitive behavior therapy, which was again good fun for us to do. By this time, cognitive therapy is starting to develop an empirical database, cognitive behavior therapies, and emerging studies were suggesting that there might be something to it, and there might be some utility, and it was nice to be able to bring those data in. Jerry Clairman, who I also think of one of my 3 primary mentors, Tim Beck, Marty Seligman, and Jerry Clairman. Clairman at that time up at Harvard, just ready to move to Columbia, was an absolutely superb research psychiatrist. Ended up, I think, shortly after going on to be head of NIMH. And what Clairman always did was suggest that anything that people wanted to practice, and particularly anything that people thought they ought to be able to charge people money to practice for, ought to be evaluated. He thought anything could be tested, be it pharmacotherapy, be it psychotherapies, et cetera. And he was also one of the 3 people who had a major impact on me and on my training of those times. And for to bring somebody in to do the medications chapter, they couldn't have come up with a better person than Clairman for that. By the 4th edition, Tim and I are still doing the chapter on cognitive therapy, and the field's becoming increasingly mature and more studies are coming out. In the 3rd chapter, in the previous edition, I can remember being annoyed as I wrote the chapter at how few of the studies were actually done in clinical populations. Many of them were analog trials, but by the time we got to the 4th edition, that was really beginning to change, and good for the folks in the field doing that. Professor Clairman, Jerry Clairman, brought on Myrna Weissman, his longtime colleague and collaborator. John Markowitz, a couple of other folks who were really quite good, Kathy Shear, Laster on. And although I didn't go back and reread that chapter, no doubt that it was a broader, more comprehensive and more even more thoughtful chapter going in. The bottom line at that time would have been that psychotherapies and medications each were relatively efficacious, and the two together would be more efficacious still. And we'll have some things to say about that as we go further into the talk. By the fifth edition, Tim and I are still doing the chapter on cognitive therapy. We've got emerging trends. The data are getting richer. The studies are getting better. On the medication side, Michael Thace, again, good friend and colleague that I've published with in the past in Jindal, did the chapter. And again, very strong chapter, pretty much continuing the same kinds of themes. By the sixth edition, Michael Lambert is taken over as editor. Tim and I are still doing the chapter on cognitive and behavior therapies. Again, it's getting richer, it's getting bigger. We've got usually a really good database study with the figure that we can put in each of the various areas. And my longtime friend and colleague, Rob DeRubis, and his postdoc at the time, Nick Foran, and our joint psychiatric colleague, Jay Amsterdam, are doing the chapter on medications. This one takes a little bit of a departure because what Nick and Rob and Jay did in this chapter, we're talking about some of the lacunae in the medication treatments. The folks in the past had certainly been really top flight psychiatric types. Jay Amsterdam's a top flight psychiatric type, but he was a bit of a provocateur. And one of the things that we're starting to get a bit concerned about, particularly for the antidepressants, is that while they may suppress symptoms over the short run, they may do so at the long-term expense of the people that take them. And we'll come back and talk about that more as we go in. But this was almost the kind of the first volley. And in this sense, Nick and Jay and Rob were a bit ahead of the times. This is going to be one of the first times that these kinds of issues are really being brought up in a responsible way. We get to the seventh edition. And again, I would agree with what Michael was saying earlier. It's an absolutely marvelous edition. Michelle Newman and colleagues have taken over the cognitive behavior therapy chapter. It's superb. It's better than anything that Hollon and Beck had come up with in the previous editions. I recommend it strongly. On the right, down below, there's an additional chapter that's added reflecting one of the new major trends in the field, and that's use of machine learning to develop precision treatment rules that help you optimize, identify the optimal treatment for a given patient. And again, Rob DeRubis, a longtime friend and colleague, is the senior author on that, but Zach Cohn is taking the lead in the US in pushing those kind of efforts forward. And Jamie Delgado in the UK is the leading figure over there. And again, I would recommend that chapter highly. On the right-hand side, the medications chapter, what I did, having been brought back in first time since the second edition and following up on the almost kind of the gauntlet that my colleagues had laid down back in the sixth edition, I brought in a couple of additional colleagues. Paul Andrews is an evolutionary biologist, and I've met Paul about 10 years earlier, and he'd asked me to read an article that he had written with his psychiatric colleague, Andy Thompson, where they laid out an evolutionary perspective on depression, which basically said that they thought that depression was not a disorder, at least unipolar depression, not a disorder, but instead an evolved adaptation, and that the function that it evolved to serve was to help people ruminate. It's just crazy. That's just bizarre. 30 years of experience, my job is to help people not ruminate and to get over it. But they had a very different perspective, and I'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes. But we brought in Paul Andrews. We brought in Matt Keller. Matt's an evolutionary geneticist at the University of Colorado, and you'll see in a couple of minutes why we wanted to bring him into this kind of endeavor. Daisy Singla is one of the rising stars in global mental health. She's a Vikram Patel protege. Managed to get early career awards in both the American Psychological Association and the Association for Psychological Science in the same year. It's the first time those two organizations have agreed on anything in the last 25 years. Marla Majle, a evolutionary psychologist, former student of Andrews, is now going on doing some really interesting things in Toronto. And then Benoit Molsant, who's the head of psychiatry at the University of Toronto. Always, you want a top flight biologically oriented psychiatrist to join you in these kind of works. And what we're going to really talk about, and I'm going to move on to here, what we're really going to talk about in a couple of minutes are the indications that from a perspective of evolutionary biologists, most of the things that are non-psychotic disorders are not indeed disorders. They're the product of evolved adaptations, that they evolved to serve a function, and that any kind of intervention that best facilitates the functions that that adaptation evolved to serve are going to be preferred over ones that don't, that either block it, anesthetize it, et cetera. And we'll come back to that in more detail. Let me stop here at this point before I go further and ask Juan or others, were there any comments, questions, things I should address before I go on? No?
Not yet, not on the chat, Stephen.
Okay, very good. Then I'll continue. Diagnostic and Statistics Manual has grown over time. I think Kraepelin was brilliant. I think the distinction between the manic depression and dementia praecox was right on target. I think since that time, we've generated far too many categories. You can see with each successive edition how the number of diagnoses has grown, the number of pages has grown. And it's striking that each person from Spitzer on, the edition 3, that's overseen the revision, has ended up criticizing it once they were done. Spitzer did for 3, Alan Francis has for 4. I haven't seen Kupfer do it yet for 5, but it's almost going to have to happen. I mentioned the evolutionary perspective. This comes out of Paul Andrews and his student Starasco's chapter in Drubus and Strunk, Oxford Handbook of Mood Disorders. There are a couple of key concepts in evolutionary biology, which I think do inform psychology. First is that it's not survival of the fittest, it's inclusive fitness, which means it's not just whether or not an individual is going to pass his or her genes on, it's whether their biological relatives are going to pass their genes on. What that means is that it leaves all kind of room for things like altruism. It's going to be a partial explanation for why people who are suicidal think that they're a burden on their families, etc. The notion is that it's not your survival that's key, it's the gene line that you belong to that's key. And if you look the first little bullet point down under that, there's something that passes for humor among evolutionary biologists, which is, I would not give my life for my brother, but I would give my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. And if you do the math, that's exactly the break-even point between your genes and the genes of the people that are related to you. If you help 2 brothers survive, your gene line comes out ahead. 8 cousins pass their genes on, your gene line comes out ahead. Additional notions is that from a perspective of an evolutionary biologist, what we have are selfish genes. We are basically survival machines, the purpose for which is to pass our genes on. We're designed to ensure the propagation of the gene lines. Richard Dawkins did a classic text back about 25 years ago that's gone through various variations. And the 3 things you have to have as prerequisites for evolution: you need variation, have to be difference between the individuals. You then need selection. There have to be forces that pick winners and losers in that battle for propagation. And there has to be retention. Whatever it is that helps some individuals win and others not has to be retained, and that's what the genes do for us. What an evolutionary biologist will do is something called reverse engineering. If they get something that it already exists, but they don't know what it was, how it got there, how it's supposed to function, they take it apart and they try to put it back together again and make it work again. The metaphor might be, if you found a watch on a beach, how do you try to, and you didn't know what a watch was, how do you try to figure out what a watch is, what it does? And we'll see how that's going to be relevant to the discussion as well. There are ancestral selection pressures. We don't know exactly what the life was like for our ancestors. What we do know is that some survived, some didn't, some passed their gene lines on, some didn't. But over time, those individuals who were most successful were the ones who passed their genes on. And those of us that are here today because our ancestors beat their competitors in the race for gene propagation. Finally, evolutionary medicine. And in evolutionary medicine, it's a basic principle that those interventions that most facilitate a function that an adaptation evolved to serve are to be preferred over those that do not. Okay. Additionally, when we come to diagnostic issues, Jerome Wakefield has been one of the leading critics of our current diagnostic system. And over time, last 20, 30 years, you see each subsequent person who oversees DSM ends up agreeing that Wakefield was right all along, not when they're doing the revision, but after they're done with the revision, they think the next person revising ought to pay more attention to Wakefield. What Wakefield would say is we ought to have as a two-part definition of disease. First, for something to be considered a disease, you must have a dysfunction and an evolved adaptation. Something that was designed to function a certain way has to stop functioning the way it was designed to function. Now, negative affects, as best we can tell, actually function the way that they evolved to serve. They're serving their purpose. And we'll come back and talk about that more later. But in general, anxiety keeps you safe from harm. Pain keeps you from doing additional damage to injured tissues. We're not quite clear what role depression plays. There are arguments about that. But Wakefield and the evolutionary biologists from very different perspectives would argue that the things which are non-psychotic quotes disorders that revolve around negative affects are probably things that evolved because they helped our ancestors survive and propagate their genes. The additional part of the definition is for something to be considered a disease is it must be harmful to the organism. There's a small number of individuals that have the heart on the right side of their body, and it doesn't matter. Heart works just fine. So the notion that something is not where it usually is or differentiates one individual from another is not a problem if it doesn't interfere with their function, their survival, and the propagation of their gene line. And from Wakefield's perspective, we ought to have that kind of two-part definition. Many of the things we have in the current diagnostic nomenclature do not fit the first definition, and many of them also may or may not fit the second. The second thing that we have come down to is the notion that affects may cause distress, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're a disease. Just because we don't like something doesn't mean that it's a problem. What affects do is they coordinate a whole body response. That means that they organize our physiological responsivity. They organize the way we think. They organize the way we are inclined to behave, and different affects produce different kinds of whole body responses. Anxiety seems to be the most reasonable response to some kind of threat, and it gets us ready to fight or to flee. It gets us ready, it gets us thinking about dangers, etc. Pain is an unpleasant experience, but it serves to protect us from doing additional damage to tissues. And anybody that's an avid pro football fan, as I am, knows that players who get injured one week can be shot up with cortisol, get them out on the field the next week. And these are some of the best athletes ever. And in 30 years, they're not going to be able to walk. So paying attention to pain and not simply overriding is probably good for the individual, if not for the species. We don't know exactly what depression evolved to serve, but there's no reason to think that depression, like pain, like anxiety, isn't also an evolved adaptation. And we'll come back and talk about some of that. A grief response is a good example of what we mean by that. We know that virtually any of us would have a grief reaction if we lost somebody close to us. We don't know exactly why. We have some guesses, some hypotheses, but you wouldn't consider that a disease or a disorder, although we go back and forth as to whether or not we ought to. The final thing is that something does not need to be a disease in order to be treated. If I get a headache, I take an aspirin. I don't necessarily have to assume that a tension headache is a disease, but I also don't have to necessarily tolerate the pain. It's a matter of whether it's in my best interest or not, and I want to pay attention to that. Okay. This chart shows up in modified form in the chapter that we did. And this comes out of Matt Keller's marvelous program of research. What Matt, the evolutionary geneticist, points out is that we have two particularly relevant things to consider when we look at any kind of disorder: the heritability and the prevalence. And if you start at the top, there are single gene mutations, Mendelian disorders. They're very, very rare. And if you're going to try to manage one of those Mendelian disorders, you're probably going to have to manage it medically. We have no particular psychotherapy that we know that's going to be particularly helpful there. We then go down to the serious mental disorders, things like psychotic bipolar disorder or the schizophrenias. They're marked by high heritability. Heritability coefficients get up in the 0.8 range, low prevalence, 1 to 2% of the population each. And for the treatment there, we're talking about starting with pharmacotherapies or somatic interventions. Now, psychotherapies may be useful, but they're going to be useful as adjuncts, not as primary means of treatment. We then go to the common mental disorders, and these are the non-psychotic disorders. Usually revolve around some kind of affective experience, unpleasant affective experience, and they're marked by low or moderate heritability, around 0.3 to 0.4 range. That's less heritable than political preference, but high prevalence. They're fairly common in the population. And if you look at OCD and panic, they're about 2 to 3%. But if you add all the anxiety disorders together, you get up to the 20 to 30% of the population. You look at depression, already there we're looking at about 15 to 16% of the population. And what you can say, and what we talk about in the chapter, is for any of the non-psychotic disorders that revolve around negative affects, there are one or more psychotherapies that do at least as well as medications, many of them having enduring effects. You could almost make a good prediction about what kind of interventions are going to work best for a given disorder if you pay attention to those two characteristics: the heritability and the prevalence. High heritability, low prevalence. Probably we're talking about medical management. Low to modest heritability, high prevalence, we're probably talking about evolved adaptations, which are not truly disorders in the sense that DSM would want us to think about them. Sim and Hagen, article I'd strongly recommend. Ed Hagen is an evolutionary biologist. I think Sim is probably one of his graduate students. A lovely article. They talk about a 4-part classification for what we consider the mental disorders. It's something they would think about as replacing DSM. And the 4 things that they would talk about are what they call developmental disorders. And those, again, are the high heritability, low prevalence disorders. And the examples there are autism, schizophrenia, and psychotic bipolar disorder. They also list OCD. I'm not quite sure I'd go there with them, but it's at least a platypus. Then they talk about the evolved adaptations. These are things they don't consider disorders. They revolve around negative affect. They are marked by low to modest heritability and high prevalence. Anxiety, depression, PTSD would be examples there. Now, they don't necessarily relate it to the treatment, but we do in the chapter. They then talk about a 3rd category, which are the dementias. That's where the brain is simply starting to break down: Alzheimer's, strokes, etc. And there you're primarily trying to remediate into the symptom side effects that go, and you're probably not going to have much success with psychotherapy as doing anything other than helping keep tissues intact as best you can. And then a 4th category that they talk about is being evolutionary mismatches. And something like ADHD, it is probably the case in our evolutionary ancestral past that for a 5-year-old not be able to sit still for very long didn't matter much. If you're in a kindergarten with the other 5-year-olds are sitting still in their seat, then you're going to get in trouble. The other thing they talk about, but they talk about to rule out, and I think they're a little too quick to rule out, is substance abuse. We didn't have major problems with substance abuse until we had access to substance. We had to be able to turn grapes into wine. We had to be able to scrape off the poppy to get opiates, etc. We've developed difficulties with substance abuse that probably weren't problems in our evolutionary past. And again, I recommend that article to you strongly. Comment on unipolar versus bipolar disorders. Most of my time spent being interested in depression, and there's the major differentiation in depressive disorders between unipolar, those are individuals who have depressions only, versus bipolar disorder, those are individuals who have one or more manic episodes. Now, they usually are also going to have depressive episodes. They probably spend more time of their life depressed than being manic or hypomanic. But there's some additional differences as well. Unipolar disorder is far more common than bipolar disorder by a factor of at least 10. And I'll show you some data at least information down the line that suggests it may be even a bigger discrepancy than that. The other thing that's notable is that women predominate the unipolar disorder. It's at least a 2-to-1 ratio. It starts showing up in early adolescence, and it stays, that differentiation stays across the lifespan. In bipolar disorder, it's an even split, as it is for the schizophrenias, as it is, not for autism, but it is for the other major psychotic disorder. So we have two quotes disorders, both of which with depression showing up in each, that show very different characteristics in terms of their associated psychopathological characteristics. Again, it would tend to make you think that these are not exactly the same thing. And I for me, my guess is that probably we're dealing with involved adaptation for unipolar disorders, at least not psychotic ones, and maybe something which is an actual disease or disorder when you get to bipolar. I'm going to pop here, I'll pop there. Now, let me stop for a moment and again, ask for any questions, thoughts, comments, things that people have before I go on. Any? None? I'll take silence as a word. Okay. I've been teaching a class the last couple of years in the undergraduate class that tends to be highly subscribed. With the largest class we have holds about 300. I get about 300 kids signing up. And the focus of the class is all the things I was wrong about a decade ago. And I think that's why that many kids sign up for it. I think they enjoy watching a college professor admit error and ignorance. But I've the few mistakes that I haven't made across the course of my career. On the left-hand side, we have the conventional wisdom, which is that depression is a disease or a disorder. On the right-hand side, we have this evolution, growing evolutionary perspective that unipolar depression's an evolved adaptation. It is something that evolved to serve a function. We don't know exactly what function it served, but it's there for a reason, much like pain or anxiety. Maybe bipolar disorder represents a breakdown of that mechanism. And bipolar disorder, highly heritable, evenly distributed across the genders. Those are little factoids that may turn out to be relevant. Okay. The subtitle here was it's all about the squids and the sea bass. And I spent the first 5 years of my acquaintance with Andrews arguing with him about how wrong he was. And it wasn't until I read this article done by Crook and colleagues about squids and sea bass that all of a sudden the light bulb turned on for me. Sea bass eats squid. Squid, as best we can tell, prefer not to be eaten by sea bass, and each has a characteristic pattern of behaviors they engage in. The sea bass be swimming around. If they see a food source in the water like a squid, they'll start a pursuit at part 2. If they get closer, they'll start to go into attack formation. The fins get extended, the mouth gets open, and if they're lucky, they capture the meal. The squids, on the other hand, will start with a kind of a primary defense, a kind of mottled color. If they get the sense that there's a predator in the neighborhood, they'll start to do a secondary defenses. They change colors more rapidly. They'll then move into an avoidance swim process as the predator gets even closer. If things get really close, they'll shoot ink out of their escape jet, and sometimes they're lucky enough to escape. What Crook and colleagues did was they took quartets of squids and maimed 2 out of the 4. And what they did is they removed one of the swimmers from 2 of the squids and not the other 2. And in a randomized design, they did it either under anesthesia or not under anesthesia. So one of the squids wasn't harmed, no anesthesia. The other squid wasn't harmed, but with anesthesia, just to rule out the effects of anesthesia. A third squid had a swimmer removed, no anesthesia, and a fourth squid had a swimmer removed with anesthesia. And then they put these quartets of squids in a tank with a hungry sea bass and watched who got eaten. What you get is this. On the far left-hand side, those squids that weren't operated on, no anesthesia, did just fine. They started did better. They started their evasive procedures relatively early, and they were the least likely to be caught by the sea bass. The ones who were operated on anesthesia did just about as well. No particular effect of the anesthesia. The third and the fourth are the ones that are relevant to the discussion. The third bar are the squids that were operated on without the anesthesia, and they were more likely to be eaten than the ones that were physically intact, but they were less likely to be eaten than the ones that were operated on under the anesthesia. The moral here is then the bottom line here is we don't know exactly how squids do with pain, what they perceive, but somehow the information was in the squid that it had to do something different than it typically did if they were operated on without the anesthesia. And what they did is they started their avoidance swim sooner. They started avoiding the sea bass before any of the other squids did. It's as if they knew something that helped protect them from the predation that otherwise would have occurred because they weren't swimming that well. Then I got the notion that that's when it occurred to me what was meant by these unpleasant affects like pain being evolved adaptations that served a function, being able to in some way recognize that they had been operated on or injured, having something that approximates pain in a squid kept them alive. And it's that third group that did better than the fourth. That was the thing. Then I started being more receptive to Andrew's arguments. Let me stop here for a moment. Any other thoughts that have come in, questions that have come in? 9. Okay. Second point, the thing that I'll talk about is the notion that depression serves no useful purpose. And if the evolutionary biologists like Andrews are correct, then it does. We may not know exactly what it is, but we have some speculation. In our ancestral past, and even in our closest primate relatives, like the baboons that Sapolsky studies, it is deadly to be ostracized from the troop. You live in troops, you live in these family groups because there's some strength in numbers. And if you get ostracized from the troop, the odds are you're going to get picked off by predators or you're going to starve. That is particularly problematic for young females caring for an infant. And in baboons, females start getting pregnant and having infants shortly after they come of age biologically. In human beings, we know that depression, unipolar depression, bipolar as well, but we know that unipolar depression really kicks off in early adolescence. That's the time that people become capable of being reproductively active. And we know that the rate of incidence of depression takes off in young women as compared to young men. Now, it might just be that they tend to have relationships with young men and men aren't good at relationships, but for whatever reason, it sits harder on women than it does on men. And recall, that's for unipolar depression, not for bipolar depression. Rates of depression, bipolar depression are comparable between the two genders. So something's going on in unipolar depression. Something is going on that's timed to the onset of adolescence. Something is going on that's timed to the onset of time when the cost to your gene line would be greater. A young, reproductively capable female with an infant is going to cost your gene line more if she gets driven out of the troop than it's going to cost a male. And again, it begins to, these little factoids begin to suggest a mosaic of things that begin to piece together. Okay, I'll stop here for a moment. Any comments yet that have come up? Questions? Okay, if not, then the next thing that I was wrong about 10, 15 years ago that I think is starting to be corrected is that depression is the most prevalent, single most prevalent of the psychiatric disorders, all the anxiety disorders in aggregate out to about 30%. Depression, once you add in dysthymia, et cetera, gets you up to about 20, 25%. And on the right-hand side, what we're learning is that depression is not only as prevalent as we used to think it was, it's a lot more prevalent than we ever realized. As a matter of fact, unipolar depression may be so prevalent that it's species typical. Yeah. Let me stay here for a moment. Most of our estimates of prevalence are based on retrospective epidemiological surveys. And those retrospective epidemiological surveys would say, identify population, interview them over the course of a year, and they'll take people of all ages. And when you do that, you guys may have seen this kind of graph before. This is a graph that looks at the cumulative rate of depressions as a function of when somebody was born. And on the far right, we've got depressions in the very elderly. And as you go back to the left, you've got younger and younger people. Well, it turns out that every time a journalist looks at this, we'll start getting calls saying, what's this epidemic of depression nowadays? Now, we probably do have an epidemic going now currently, but over the last 100 years, that just hasn't been the case. What's happening is older people don't remember episodes in their 20s. Younger people in their 20s do. We have a systematic bias that's built in. Scott Monroe, Anderson, and Kate Harkness, a really classic paper that I recommend you guys, showed up in 2019 in Psychological Review. They look at the birth cohort studies, the studies like the Dunedin sample that have identified everybody born in Dunedin, New Zealand in a given 2-year period of time. And they've been following them now for the last 45 years, interview them every couple of years, and they really tracking things in real time in terms of what people have. What they're finding, and the Dunedin sample is only up in their mid-40s. And by the way, the longitudinal studies that track people across the course of adolescence, pre-adolescence, not much depression, post is when it really starts hitting, are showing very similar kinds of things. What they're finding is that the prevalence of depression is about 3 to 5 times higher than we ever realized. The retrospective epidemiological surveys are underestimating the prevalence of depression. The prospective birth cohort studies are telling us 3 to 5 times higher. And given that these folks are only up in their early 40s now, and they're going to have 30, 40 more years to have first episodes if they haven't had one yet, it may get close to unity. It's like pain, it's like anxiety. People would now talk about depression being species typical, meaning any of us could get depressed if something bad enough happens. I'm going to skip the things about the stress sensitization, come back to in a moment. But what Anderson and Harkness, Monroe, Anderson, and Harkness are saying is that there may really be two subtypes of depression, one of which these are individuals come into adolescence with no particular pre-existent diathesis to get depressed, and it takes something really, really bad. And the others are folks who come into adolescence with a predisposition to get depressed when something happens, and it doesn't have to be that bad. It might be innate, it might be acquired. It looks like it's a mixture model that's going on, and it seems to be consistent with the data. The green bars are the folks who are not at any particular risk for depression. If they get depressed, and they will, it's almost always in response to some really awful life event, loss of somebody close to them, loss of jobs, et cetera, et cetera. The blue bars are folks who get depressed easily. It doesn't take that much for them to get depressed. And they're the people that Monroe and Anderson Harkness refer to as the recurrence prone. In terms of the first episode, patients are about evenly divided. If you look at people who have multiple episodes, it's almost always recurrence prone, and the folks who are depression capable, given that most of us don't have that many really awful things happen to us, a smaller and smaller proportion of the folks with multiple episodes represent that other groupage. We've had this notion for about the last 30 years. Robert Post brought it up, and it was a brilliant observation. He was linking depressions to epilepsy, and noting that, thinking that perhaps any episode of depression increased your risk for subsequent episodes. And these were the kind of data we looked at. You can do a pretty good job of predicting the odds that somebody's going to have another episode of depression by how many they've had in the past. It looks like no episodes, the odds are about 15%. One episode goes up to 60, 2 episodes goes up to 80, 3 episodes it goes up to 90. What we interpreted that to mean was that any given individual in their brain acquired a greater sensitization, a kindling effect, if you will, to subsequent episodes. And those data are just not consistent with the birth cohort studies or the adolescent studies. A smaller group of people are prone to have lots of episodes. They account for most of the recurrences, and a larger group of people are just going to have 1 or 2. And it's the larger group of people that need something big to trigger it. That's why you have that linkage between some clear-cut precipitant and the onset of a first or second episode that's hard to find for subsequent episodes. It's just a mixture of the depression possible, takes something big, but they're not going to have many, and the recurrence prone, it doesn't take that much, and they're going to have lots. Let me stop here. Issues? Not at the moment? Okay. Rumination as a symptom of depression. This is the thing I thought Paul Andrews was just dead wrong on. My wife Judy still thinks he's dead wrong on. He would say that rumination is the function that depression evolved to serve, and that it's clinicians that gave rumination a bad name. If you look up rumination in a regular dictionary, it says to think carefully about an issue. If you look up the medical dictionary, it says to go round and round without getting anywhere. What he points out is that when we get sad, and you can induce that experimentally, or you follow people who are depressed, we switch from rapid type 1 processing, the kind of Kahneman and Tversky heuristic thinking where we jump to conclusions quickly, which works pretty well most of the time, into a slower type 2 process where we're much more thoughtful, careful about how we put things together, and which is energetically more expensive. We have to bring the hippocampus in with short-term memory. So you don't want to go there unless you have to. When you get sad, you go there. If you get somebody to ruminate, you'll make them sad and they're going to go there. And we even have evidence in animal models, rodent models, that the same kind of process holds in the mammalian species that we've looked at. Sadness makes you think more carefully, okay? Makes you ruminate. Andrews has data which suggests, if you look to the left, if you're depressed, it increases what he would call what is that called? Causal analysis. Makes you think about what's making me sad, what's making me unhappy, which then leads to a problem-solving solution, which then tracks back and reduces the depression. Most episodes of depression are going to resolve, they're going to spontaneously remit, even in the absence of treatment. And our ancestral past, that's the only way they ever would have gone away. You would expect, in engineering terms, you would expect an affect like depression, if it evolved to serve a purpose, to serve that purpose and then to go away. And the way it goes away, according to Andrews, and some of the data suggests that he might be onto something here, is they generate a process which helps you solve the problem that generated the distress in the first place. And once you generate a solution to the stress and the problem goes away, then you can stop being sad. The same kind of thing. The data that they've been collecting are just consistent with this model. I never would have guessed that. I wouldn't have put my money on that. But again, the good data will out. Stop here. Again, thoughts, questions. This is heresy for most of clinicians like myself, but I'm starting to adjust to this kind of notion. Again, the kind of factoids start to pile up. We've had the notion among folks that talk about medications that depression may well be caused by a deficit in nerve. Yes, please.
Forgive me, Stephen. I see that John has his hand up.
Oh, please. Yes.
Hi. Yeah. Hi, John from Helsinki.
Yes.
A principle in solution-focused therapies is that it's useful to define the problem in such a way that it's easier to solve.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
this immediately starts me thinking about how much easier it would be to work with depression, so-called depression, defined in this way as compared to the way it's been defined earlier. I love this.
I think it's a great comment, and it's curious. Some of the particularly effective therapies, like problem-solving therapy, go straight at the core of that. Most of the cognitive behavioral therapies build in a problem-solving component. Interpersonal psychotherapy focuses on relationships, but they basically help you work on resolving problems in relationships. And most of the therapies, of course, most therapies are effective for depression, but most that are effective build in the notion that what you're doing here is helping to work through the issues that got you depressed in the first place. And I think you're right. It's affecting the way I start thinking about my clinical work now. Change in perspective. Great comment. Anything else from anybody else before I go on? I'm going to talk about medications for a minute. We have the notion, I'll skip over this or make a very brief comment. We have the notion that people who are, because medications work in one of two ways, either they block metabolism of the presynaptic neuron, which in this particular slide is up at the top, or they block reuptake from the neurotransmitter, or it's released into the synapse. Those are the little transporters, serotonin transporter, that little purplish thing, and the norepinephrine transporter, little bluish dot. By the way, you wouldn't get serotonin and norepinephrine in the same neuron ever, but the same structure works for the neuron. Because we know that the medications work, and because we know that the immediate proximal effect of the medications is to increase the amount of neurotransmitter in the synapse, we've assumed for the last 50 years that depression may be caused by a deficit in neurotransmitter in the synapse. Turns out that there's no deficit. As a matter of fact, the one study in humans parallels what we know from numerous studies in animals made helpless or other kinds of induction paradigms. Was done by Barton and colleagues back in Australia in 2008. And they put an indwelling catheter in the jugular vein and measured the major metabolites of serotonin coming most directly out of the brain. That would be the best way to measure what kind of neurotransmitter balances we have in the brain of an attacked person, because you certainly can't go in and do that in living tissue. And what they found is, on the left, people who are not depressed have a certain amount of metabolite coming out of the brain, which means they've got that much of the serotonin in the synapse. People who are currently depressed have a lot more. It's not a deficit in the synapse of the neurotransmitter, it's an excess. And that's not show up on this graph, but once these folks have been on medications for 2 or 3 weeks, that comes back down again. They look more like normal individuals. So we got it 180 degrees wrong in our common understanding. And by the way, the first-rate psychopharmacologists understand that, and people like Steve Hyman Eric Nessler wrote a classic paper back in 1996, where they pointed out most psychiatric medications work in the exact opposite way that we think they work. They work by pushing underlying homeostatic regulatory mechanisms to push back. And I'll show you how that works in a minute. The additional thing that Andrews points out is that there are additional affective related syndromes, which are not clinical depression, but they have a depressive-like aspect. They have a lot like anhedonia. You have euthymia, where energy goes in different kinds of directions. It goes to the immune system, cognition, growth, et cetera, maintenance, et cetera. If you have an illness, an infection, a lot of your energy gets sent to the immune system, differentially so. Less energy goes to cognition, you get kind of foggy headed. There's not much energy put into growth. You don't need to grow at that point in time. You need to survive. Some to the maintenance of necessary tissues, and very little interest in reproduction. You're not interested in dating at that point in time. If you're starving, the energy goes elsewhere. It goes to maintenance of necessary tissues, the brain, the heart, the liver, et cetera, and the extremities waste away. Again, you're going to be anhedonic, but you're not going to be you're at least not going to starve as rapidly, lose the vital organs. If you've got a clinical depression, the energy goes to the cortex. It goes to cognition. Again, it goes to helping you think hard about stuff. And it's one of those additional factoids that there are other evolutionary theories that come out. What they can't do is explain why the energy goes there. And one little side bar I'll mention is that one of the primary roles that serotonin plays in the body and the brain, it's not just something that responds to medications. It's primarily involved in moving energy back and forth between different systems in the body. Of course, serotonin can't think, but various brain regions directed to do it that kind of way. And it's serotonin is the neurotransmitter involved in moving energy back and forth across these systems. Now, what happens when the dorsal raphe fires? Dorsal raphe is where all the serotonergic neurons in the brain have their cell bodies that steep in the brain brainstem, which means it's very, very old. It's certainly been around for all the vertebrates. It innervates the amygdala. And when the dorsal raphe fires and the amygdala gets innervated by those neurons, it directs your attention towards whatever problem you're dealing with at the moment. It activates the hippocampus to allocate working memory to problems. That's very energy expensive. And it turns down BDNF signaling. You're not going to be building new connections in the brain. It innervates the lateral prefrontal cortex, makes you resistant to distraction. It's going to get you focusing on whatever problem you got and not thinking new thoughts. It's going to turn down the nucleus accumbens, the hedonic response system. You're going to lose interest in other things, activities that typically you would find rewarding. And it's going to turn down the hypothalamus. You're going to restrict growth, restrict reproduction, restrict physical activity. If you got a problem that you got to solve, before you get thrown out of the troop where you're going to be picked up by predators or starve, you're going to want to solve that problem before you worry about anything else going on. And we do know that that's what happens when you make people sad, and that's what happens when people are clinically depressed. Again, factoid to the evolutionary biological notions. Stop here. Then I'll get one final thing for the talk today. And the final thing is our notion that the reason our medications work is by correcting these deficits in the synapse, which we have already seen don't actually exist. It's actually in excess. The question is, how is it that putting medications on board that drive the underlying neurotransmitters in the synapse up to 4 times anything ever found in nature, how does that make you less depressed? Works out in the following fashion. This again comes from Andrew's articles. The top row are the folks who are currently not depressed. The 5-HT on the left, that's a serotonergic neuron. It's coming up from the dorsal raphe. Impulse comes down, it releases a certain amount of serotonin out into the synapse. If enough goes across, it gets picked up by a neuron, postsynaptic neuron. In this case, it's a glutamatergic neuron, not necessarily central to what we're talking about now. Second row is what happens when somebody's clinically depressed. We've thought, and most practitioners think that means that they've got a deficit of serotonin in the synapse. What we've seen from Barton and the animal studies, they actually have an excess. So they've already got more than they typically would have. That's why we get symptoms. When you got that excess of serotonin, that means the dorsal raphe is firing. It's innervating those areas that we've just seen. It makes you sad. It makes you anhedonic. It makes you focus. It makes you ruminative, etc. That's all the things depression is designed to do. When you put an SSRI on or any kind of antidepressant on that third row, what it's going to do is block reuptake if it's an SSRI. That's that little bridge-looking thing turned on its side. It's going to block reuptake. It's going to increase even further the amount of serotonin in the synapse. So now you're getting to something that is well above anything that nature has ever done. And again, how do you make something better if it's a consequence of having too much already? How does putting even more in the synapse and even more transmission through, how does that reduce the symptoms? Well, this is where the interesting thing comes in. What happens when you raise that level that high, and we know that from the animal studies, is that the underlying homeostatic regulatory mechanisms kick in and they turn the system down. They inhibit synthesis presynaptically, so you lower the amount of serotonin in the presynaptic neurons anyway. You reduce sensitivity postsynaptically. It's the flip side of what happens when you use exogenous opiate or heroin to trigger your pleasure response in your brain. The brain shuts down the production, which is fine until you lose access to that external source, and then you go through withdrawal and other things happen. What's happening here when we use our antidepressant medications is analogous to holding up a match to turn a furnace down. We're tricking the thermostat into overriding the mechanisms. Okay. If that's what's going on, and again, the biological, the physiological evidence is wholly consistent with that, what you're going to be doing is pushing back. When you put the medications on board, you're pushing back as if you're coiling a spring. You're pushing the underlying homeostatic mechanisms to turn the system down, and they're going to keep that pressure on as long as the medications stay on board. That's what's driving the underlying homeostatic regulatory mechanisms. What that means is you may well be suppressing symptoms at the expense of prolonging the life of the underlying episode. Remember, most episodes of depression are going to end on their own if things are allowed to run their course. In this case, we're not allowing things to run their course. And Andrews has looked at that, looked at those existing discontinuation trials, and what he would predict from his model is that the more any given medication perturbs the underlying neurotransmitter systems, the more likely you are to relapse when you come off that medication. And if you look on the far left, the PVO stands for placebo. People that got better while they're on pill placebo, about 1 chance in 5 they're going to relapse after you take the placebo away. They get better on SSRI, it doubles, gets over 40%. SNRI also hits at noradrenergic system, goes up to just under 50. Tricyclics, dirtier still, that gets over even the higher 50s. Fluoxetine's an unusual SSRI, which actually has noradrenergic properties at higher doses, and most folks that don't respond at first get up to higher doses, it goes higher still. And the MAOIs hit serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, all 3 of the neurotransmitters we think are involved in depression, and you have the highest rate of relapse coming off. The notion that you can't test hypotheses derived from evolutionary theory is simply not correct. You can't create the things that evolution already has created, but you can test hypotheses, and I think this is a pretty compelling success in prediction based on the degree to which any given type of medication perturbs the underlying neurotransmitter systems. Okay, interesting. Now, as always, there's an alternative explanation, which is nowadays you're not going to get further to the right unless you didn't respond to the earlier medication. So maybe what we have are simply tougher patients get put on medications that perturb more the neurotransmitter systems, and they're more likely to relapse anyway, which is a possibility. I'm going to pop through here and just say there's a way to test that. And we've got a project that we're trying to work up now in Vietnam with colleagues Bar Weiss and some of his first-rate psychiatric colleagues over there, where we want to treat folks with antidepressant medications. That's the ADM. We want to treat on the top row with people with cognitive behavior therapy. They do a pretty reasonable job in Vietnam with that. But the middle row, we want a controlled condition which is not serotonergic and also doesn't teach the kind of skills that the psychotherapies teach. And for that, we're going to use Chinese herbal medicines, being very careful to make sure that they don't have serotonergic or other antidepressant properties. They're actually preferred by folks in Vietnam over Western medications. We're going to treat folks first to remission, keep them on their treatments for another 8 months or so till they get any reasonable definition of recovery, and then we cut them loose. If medications have a previously unrecognized iatrogenic effect where they're suppressing symptoms at the expense of prolonging the episode, the folks who come off medications, the red line at the bottom, ought to be more likely to relapse than the folks in the middle that got better on the Chinese herbal medicines. If cognitive behavior therapy truly has an enduring effect, because all the trials that suggest it does have been direct comparisons to medications, and it's possible that medications are iatrogenic and not that cognitive therapy is enduring, then the cognitive therapy should do better than the Chinese herbal medicines. So again, I think we have questions that have been raised by this evolutionary perspective that I think we can use our clinical trials to answer. I'm going to pop back here. Let me stop here. Any thoughts, questions, issues? Happy to take any there are. Now, I will point out that we're at about an hour in, and I've probably got about another 5 hours left in me, but I don't know about the audience. Are there folks who would like me to continue for the next module or two? If there are, I'm happy to go on. One person, I'm happy to go on. As a matter of fact, sometimes I've been in a room alone going on.
Please go on.
Please go on. And as a reminder to our audience, don't forget that you can speak with Stephen by raising your hands, as John did a couple of minutes before, or also by typing in the chat box.
Lovely, lovely. And again, thank you guys. This will take the pressure off my in-laws, who always get annoyed when I bring slides to family gatherings. So this will help me. I get at least a week out of my system on this.
Stephen, forgive me. We have a raised hand by Michael. So Michael, please. Go ahead.
Hi, Steve. I'm just interested at a kind of broader level in terms of this trial that you're sort of in process of. I mean, I'm struck by two things. One is the large N, which is wonderful.
Yep. And
the other is the fact that you're going to Vietnam to do this, which in a sense, is that a kind of, is that to do with the specific demands of accessing the Chinese sort of medicine, or is it something that actually is a criticism of the kind of Western way of doing research, which is that we've been so narrow in our perspective and not been looking to involve, other wider countries, et cetera, et cetera?
The latter, I think, is certainly true. And I've the last decade, I've had the great good fortune of falling in with people that do global mental health. Vikram Patel,
exactly.
and Daisy Single, his marvelous protege, and a whole host of folks. So I've been doing work already with these folks in India, and the Vietnam was a relatively reasonable extension. Bar Weiss is a colleague of mine here at Vanderbilt, and when I gave a talk, basically prelude to this talk here at Global Health meeting about 3 or 4 years ago, he got quite excited. Bar has spent the last 25 years helping the folks in Vietnam develop their mental health system. And he's been very integral to that process. He basically lives there now. He's still at Vanderbilt, but he's doing most of his research over there. About 10, 15 years ago, NIMH decided that we knew everything we needed to know about treatment. So they stopped funding outcome trials. And what they did fund, and I think good that they're funding, are trials where you identify a possible mechanism and then you follow forward. First, you show you can change the mechanism, then you see what happens if you do. And Rob and I and other colleagues have always looked for mechanisms, but we start with an outcome of interest. We generate that outcome, and then we take a look at trying to identify what might have been causal mechanisms from the measures that we get along the way. So it's I like the notion. I like RDoC. I like the notion of looking for underlying causal processes. But I think the way they implemented the RDoC in the States, they tied scientists' hands, one of their hands behind their back, and I can't get funded for the kind of studies I'm used to doing. Now, the Wellcome Trust is absolutely marvelous, and we took this idea of the Wellcome Trust back in maybe 2012, 2013. Anke Ehlers was very helpful in getting me to get this set up. David Clark and Chris Fairburn as well were quite supportive along the line. Phil Cowan was going to help. There's a superb guy, block of the fellow's name, at the UCL, head of psychiatry there, was going to work on that as well. We got it all the way to an interview at the Wellcome Trust, and they were concerned about the power. And they liked the idea, thought it was a great, interesting notion. They were concerned about the power. And what I should have said is, look, given the sample sizes we're looking at, it's either going to be one or it's going to be the other, unless it absolutely splits the difference. We've got sufficient power to detect, but I didn't do that, and we had ended up not getting funded. It spilled over the rest of that week. We didn't get funding. We got that close to getting funded, and in Wellcome Trust, if you're not a citizen of the Commonwealth, you only get one shot.
Oh,
so what do you know? Vasectomies.
Right. Okay.
If you have something that you want to do, you find some way to eventually to do it. And Bar and his colleagues in Vietnam were more than interested, more than willing. So what do you know?
Okay. Well, no, I just comment. I just think it's really interesting that increasingly we interface with global health, because I just think that's where we need to be moving some way. So I just take my hat off to you on this one. It's great.
And I could not agree more. I don't know if you guys know, but India has just passed China as the most populous country in the world. And 10 years ago, a third of all people living in the world lived in China, and a fifth lived in India. And now I forget exactly what the percentage are, but India has passed China. So it's a great place to do research. They're absolutely superb scientists, practitioners out there, but not many practitioners. So when you come in to do a study, these folks get everybody's likely to get depressed. They have everybody the same kind of needs, and they have virtually no access to any kind of reasonable mental health systems outside of the larger cities. So yeah, it's you can kill three birds with one stone. You can do good science in a way that is going to be perhaps helpful to people that have very little access to things that would be useful to them. Anyway,
okay, thank you.
Lovely. I'm going to pop a couple of the slides. They're in there anyway, because I want to get to the that's the granddaughter. I promised the baby at the end. Other two questions that we talk about in the chapter. One is, can we optimize treatment selection? We have an array of treatments that work, and most of our treatments do work. Virtually any treatment that has been tried, be it pharmacological or psychological, works better than its absence. And as anybody that's read the editions of the handbook would know, you have to, the biggest chunk of the effect comes from the non-specific factors that go along. Pim Kuipers did a marvelous meta-analysis of all of the randomized controlled trials in the treatment of depression. He's amassed them all. He's got them all there, and he did a very clever breakdown of how you can decompose the variance in the outcomes. You've got some of the comparisons are compared to an absence of treatment or minimal treatment as usual conditions, and comparing those to non-specific controls, you get an estimate of how much goes to the non-specific factors. You then compare the non-specifics to the quotes mainline medications and or manual-driven treatments. You get an estimate of what the specific effects look like. And what he got was, in the overall across the entire literature, about a third of the variance would have happened anyway. That's spontaneous remission. About half of the variance was attributable to the non-specific factors, all the things that folks at SBR are particularly attuned to and very much knowledgeable in study. And about a sixth of the variance went to the specific factors, the things that people like me have spent our career arguing about at conferences. So it's a humbling experience when you see that. That being said, there's very good reason to think that different individuals might well respond differentially to different treatments. And we now have the technologies that allow us to explore that. I'm going to pop this. My colleague, Rob DeRubis, was one of the first out of the box in the Penn Vandy study that we did back in the aughts. We had a psychotherapy compared to medications, pill placebo control, both cognitive behavior therapy and medications beat the placebo. They're about comparable to one another, but we have pretty good reason to think that different individuals might respond differentially to each. And there were 5 indices that popped out in particular. Personality disorder, if you had one, you did better on medications than you did on cognitive therapy. And if you didn't, it worked the other way around. Prior medication history, the more prior medications, the worse on medications. Marital status, people with a history of marriages or at least relationships do better in the psychotherapy than medications. Employment status, folks who are unemployed did much better in cognitive therapy than they did on medications. And number of stressful life events, the more precipitants, the better in cognitive therapy than you did in medications. You put those together in use machine learning to put together a larger index, and you get, for any given individual, a predicted advantage score. It turns out in looking at our data set that we had already, had we known who should have gotten what in the beginning, we could have enhanced response for those folks for whom it mattered. It didn't matter for everybody. For about half the sample, it would have mattered by about 3.5 points. That's bigger than the drug placebo difference. If we could make our treatments more effective, even before we improve the treatments themselves, just by getting the right alternative to the right individual, then we're really ahead of the game. Vikram Patel is the fellow that I've fallen in with, and thanks to Chris Fairburn and Terry Wilson for introducing me to Vikram. And Vikram has a non-governmental organization in India. He's been at this for about 25 years now. It's called Sangat. He's got 3 different sites, one in Goa, one in Delhi, and one in Bhopal. And they've been doing a series of very well-designed trials, all with the idea of seeing how can we take existing technologies and make them accessible to people that have very little access to any kind of psychological, psychiatric treatments. And the one trial, he's been at this for a number of decades now, but the one trial I was played a minor role in was a project where they took a behavioral activation, went through the process of doing focus groups, pilot studies, et cetera, to make it culturally acceptable to folks in India. For example, there's a lovely global mental health study that Myrna Weissman folks did in rural Uganda, where they did their treatments IPT in a group format. People in the village would come together, they would talk, they talk about relationship issues. And one of Vikram's early trials, he tried that in India, and it blew up. It did not work at all. In India, what you do not do is discuss family problems outside of the family. So same treatment, but you just had to do it in individual kind of family systems. At any rate, long story short, in this HAP, this culturally adapted behavioral activation provided by lay counselors in 6 to 8 sessions. My God, I think I'm just beginning to know a client in 6 to 8 sessions, but these are lay counselors, basically high school graduates with no particular prior experience, professional training relative to what we're calling enhanced usual care. This is where you screen people, you identify who's depressed, you let the primary care physician know that they're depressed, you give them some guidance in terms of World Health Organization medication strategies. Virtually nobody ends up getting medicated anyway. So we're comparing HAP to almost the absence of treatment for depression. We're getting a nice treatment effect. The red line coming down over the 3 months of treatment, not even 3 months, we had 6 to 8 sessions over that time. We're getting a nice, detectable, clear-cut difference. The dashed line going out is what happens after HAP is over. And what happens is something I wouldn't have expected to see in a secondary care population. Virtually nobody's relapsing. Folks that got better stayed better. And again, my experience in secondary care psychiatric clinics, I've never gotten better than 25% survival rates in people that have had the best that we know how to do. I'm going to pop this slide. What we're now taking a look at is whether or not we can use a relatively large sample, identify pretreatment characteristics, and compare HAP, this lay counselor delivered culturally adapted version of behavioral activation versus antidepressant medication. And it should play out the following way. On the x-axis, we've got a prognostic index for HAP. Let's do the trial. Let's collect data, who does better, who does not better. We have baseline characteristics. We'll try to predict who does better in HAP than other folks. That's purely prognostic information. That doesn't help you select treatment, but it tells you who you want to select for that treatment. We'll do the same thing for medications. That's the y-axis. However, we put the two together, and the diagonal going up the middle is the general prognostic index. Some of the folks are not going to respond to either, the lower left-hand quadrant. Other folks are going to respond no matter what we give them. That's probably spontaneous remission or at least non-specific response. But the folks on the off diagonal, some of the folks, if there's some people that respond better to HAP than to medications, they'll show up in that lower right-hand quadrant. If there are folks that respond better to medications than to HAP, they'll show up in the upper quadrant, the left-hand quadrant. We're going to randomize 1,500 patients in primary care settings in India. They either get HAP or they get antidepressant medications. We'll treat for a 3-month period of time. It means our medications for 3 months, but they're getting 6 to 8 sessions of this behavioral activation during that period of time. And we'll take a look at who remits. We'll have this battery of pre-treatment measures. There'll be this kind of standard demographic information, age, sex, et cetera, history of illness, number of prior episodes, that kind of thing. We'll be taking a look at, we've been culling the literature for anything which is predictive of differential response, actually response in either modality and the differential response. And we're going to turn Ron Kessler, who's a big data maven, loose with Rob DeRubis helping out. looking over his shoulder, to use machine learning to identify which individuals should have gotten which in the beginning. Now, what we'll do is we'll set our algorithms, our precision treatment rules on the first 1,000 patients that come through, and then we'll test them on the subsequent 500, because we'll still be continuing to randomize. And back up here for a moment, if indeed it's the case that you can pick out what the best treatment is for a given individual, we'll have a good precision treatment rule, much like the Framingham heart attack risk index coming in, that clinicians ought to be able to use. We'll not only have our baseline battery of demographic, history of illness kind of things, we're also going to genotype the sample, draw blood samples, genotype. Now, in rural primary care clinics, you probably can't genotype everybody, although we will, but we'll develop precision treatment rules based on just the non-genetic information and then the genetic information added in. And we'll see what we come up with there. The additional thing I'll mention is that most of us, myself included, have done really watered down tests of mediation. If it is indeed the case that some people respond to one intervention better than they do the other, then testing for mediators in the full sample means you're including the goats with the sheep. No offense to either goats or sheep. If we put our treatment, precision treatment rule in an interaction with the patient characteristics, that's that orange box, we should be able to take out that source of the variability and get a cleaner test of whether or not something mediates for those folks who do actually show a specific response to that given intervention. We think we can not only make our overall treatment delivery more efficient, but we can also do a better job of improving the science about how we go about testing for things. Back up for a second. Let me stop here. Does that, we talk about that in the chapter. And again, we have these clear-cut modalities which are quite distinct from another: medication treatment, psychological interventions, and most of the work that's been done with using machine learning, optimizing treatment, et cetera, has looked within medications, and that's like testing Coke versus Pepsi. And usually not done much with psychotherapies because the sample sizes need to be larger, but here we can do both. And one of the things we've learned, if you do a trial in rural India, you can do 3 times the science for 1/3 the cost. Now this, for some reason, NIMH is funding. They won't fund the same study they wouldn't have funded if we proposed to do it in the States, but if we proposed to do it in India, then they fund it. So go figure. I'm delighted, and nice to find an alternate route. Let me stop here. Any thoughts, questions about this? And if not, there's one other thing I'll go on to. Okay. Last thing. Back in 2005, we had a consensus conference of people that did research on treatment of depression, psychological intervention researchers, pharmacological intervention researchers, hybrids like myself that compare one to the other. And as a consequence of the conference, we ended up doing a consensus paper, and my colleagues would kind of let me be the lead author on the paper. And what we basically concluded, looking across the literature that existed up until that time, was that each modality worked. The various psychological interventions worked better than their absence. Medications typically work better than the pill placebo controls, although probably only holds for more severely depressed patients. And the combination generally worked a bit better than either one alone. So that's the conclusion. And in addition, if you had an advantage for one modality over the other modality, the combination retained that. And that's the other thing that we said. I think I'm wrong. I was wrong. And the reason I think I was wrong, the most recent trial that I did with Rob DeRubis and colleagues, we brought a third side in, not just Penn and Vandy, we also brought the Rush Medical Center, Jan Fawcett, John Sajeka, and some of the Paula Young, some of the marvelous folks up there. Everybody got medicated because we didn't think we needed a cognitive therapy alone condition. Everybody got medicated, half had cognitive therapy on top of that. And typically in a controlled trial, you treat people for a fixed period of time and you see what proportion respond. But in the real world, you don't do that. You treat people until you get them better. So we did that. And at least as long as the IRBs would let us go with folks. We assigned folks to those treatments. We were given up to 18 months to get them into remission by our IRBs, which we kind of fudged a little bit, pushed out to 19 months. And we were given up to 36 months to get them into recovery. Recovery is, they've gone now at least 6 months in remission without having a relapse. We fudged that a little because if somebody was in remission at month 35, just got into remission month 35, we just want to push it out longer, so we got it up to 42 months. At any rate, at the point in time people were recovered, within the second randomization, we took the cognitive therapy away, and the upper rose if they got it, and half of the folks were kept on maintenance medication, half were taken off. We followed across time. If cognitive therapy truly had an enduring effect that blocked the onset of recurrences, the folks up top who had prior cognitive therapy should do better once medications are taken away than folks in the bottom once medications are taken away. We went through a whole bunch of medications. I won't bore you with that kind of thing. We did really state-of-the-art pharmacotherapy all the way up through and including MAOIs. And then some of my psychiatric colleagues became real cowboys and really got aggressive in what they were doing. And basically got this. Over the first, up to the point of recovery, we had a small, modest advantage for combined treatment over medications alone, that 73% versus 63%. And I won't show you the slides, but just so you know, that was heavily moderated. All of that effect was attributable to people who were not chronic, but were more severe. If you were chronic, you didn't get benefit from adding cognitive therapy. If you were not chronic, but less severe, you didn't need it. The medications did just fine. But anyway, we got this modest advantage. When we took when we phased out the cognitive and took the medications away, we had not a whiff of an effect from prior exposure to cognitive therapy. 8 of the trials in the literature where cognitive therapy alone has been compared to prior medication, 7 of the 8 show the enduring effect. 5 of those trials look at prior cognitive therapy compared to ongoing maintenance medication, and 4 of those 5, it does just as well. We didn't get a whiff of an enduring effect here. We were absolutely mortified and blown away. This is not what we expected. Had we expected it, we would have built a cognitive therapy alone condition from the beginning, and boy, did we ever screw up on this one. 10 years, millions of the taxpayers' dollars, and we screwed it up royally. This is just a clear demonstration of how, if you stay on medications, you didn't ever, or you had less likely to have recurrence. If you were taken off, you did, whether you had poor cognitive therapy or not. Turns out we're not the only people in the field that have found something like that. Dave Barlow had a marvelous trial in panic disorder back in year 2000, 5-site study. People got treated either with CPT for panic or imipramine antidepressant treatments. On the far end, they had roughly comparable rates of response to those conditions. There was also a CBT plus imipramine condition, and then curiously enough, a CBT plus pill placebo condition. And what they got was as follows: when folks who were better and you stopped the treatments, took the medications away, what you found was this: if you got better on CBT alone, you were less than half as likely to relapse. That's the blue bar all the way on the right. More than half less likely to relapse than if you got imipramine alone. That's the yellow bar second from the left. If you got the combination, it's like you got expensive pharmacotherapy. You're every bit as likely to relapse, maybe slightly more so than even if you got the cognitive therapy, then all you got was the medication. Notice the second from the right little bar. Those are the folks who got cognitive therapy with pill placebo. They think they're on medication. The people treating them think they're on medication. If there's any kind of expectancy effect going on, they should look like the folks in the green bar on the far left. They didn't. And what we would conclude is that it's not thinking you're taking medications. If there's a problem for the combination, it's having the medication in the actual system. Okay, it's a pharmacological effect, but it wiped out their enduring effect, which is pretty robust in panic disorder, like it's pretty robust in depression. Boom. Let me stop here. I've got about 5 more minutes where I'm going to hazard a possible explanation, which is way out of left field, and I'll do that if people want me to, or we can stop and you can express outrage now. 5 more minutes or not?
Go on.
Okay. All righty. Here's where, I'm sorry. I have to tell you, I'm not particularly conservative myself, but I do think Reagan was right about one thing. You want to trust, but you want to verify. And once I started talking with Paul Andrews with his biological background, looking at things, neurotransmitter systems of the brain, et cetera, things I don't really understand much at all. I wanted to get him in front of people that I knew understood these systems well. I wanted to hear their conversations. And we had one conference in Philadelphia that I set up a symposium. We brought him in for that. And we brought Jay Amsterdam over from Penn. And I had the 2 of them go out to dinner and have them have this conversation. And they were finishing each other's sentences. I mean, stuff that Paul was saying, Jay was in absolute agreement with, and vice versa. And I was falling out. I went to Harvard a couple of years back and basically gave an earlier version of this talk on a grand rounds. And on that trip, I took an opportunity to go over and talk to Steve Hyman, the former head of NIH, who is absolutely marvelous psychopharmacology type, and laid this out for him. I said, look, what do you think? Is this stuff off base? He said, no, of course, he's right about that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that medications is going to keep you from having your underlying spontaneous remission. It's not necessarily going to raise risk for relapse, but it's quite plausible. And what he did say is that Paul was absolutely right about how these it's not a deficit, it's an excess, and the medications work like all other psychoactive medications work. It's not their direct effect that produces the effect, it's the indirect effect when the homeostatic mechanisms push back against putting so much medication in. Final talk that I had was with final visit that I had was APA was in Denver probably about 7 years ago now, and Paul and I were both going to be there. We called Steve Mayer out at Boulder, right over the mountain, and wanted to spend the day with him, and we did. Steve Mayer was the other half of the helplessness pairing. Marty Seligman and Steve Mayer, both first-year graduate students at Penn way back in the mid-60s, and they stumbled on this curious phenomena where if you expose animals to uncontrollable stressors, you make them behaviorally passive. This is a typical helplessness paradigm. On the right, you got a control animal that's not going to get shocked at all. The animal on the far left is getting electric shocks, but it can turn them off. The escape wheel is wired up. If it turns the wheel, it turns the shock off. So it can't keep it starting, but it can make it stop. The animal in the middle is yoked to the animal on the left. It gets shocked at exactly the same time, exactly the same duration. Everything in the physical stimulus is the same. The one thing different is psychological. It does not have control. The animal on the left does, the animal in the middle doesn't. And what we know is if you take animals and put in those conditions and put them on the bottom right in a subsequent escape avoidance situations, the control animals on the far right get out of the shock situation pretty rapidly. They jump a barrier, do whatever it is appropriate for that species. The ones on the far left do as well. The ones that were had exposure to escapable shocks do well as well. The ones in the middle show what was named learned helplessness. They lie on the floor of the cage looking passive. It's like they're not trying to escape. Well, the dirty little secret in the helplessness literature, Marty went Hollywood, he went clinical and turned this into a really very interesting model for animal model for human depression. Steve Mayer went the other direction. He went basic neuroscience. And one of the dirty little secrets in the helplessness literature that Steve Mayer would be aware of, because he continued the animal research, is that it's not the case that the animals in the middle always do worse. They do worse if it's a simple, easily solved problem that requires a quick type A kind of response, jumping a barrier, running fast, turning a wheel. That's things rats are wired up to do. If it's a more complicated problem of reversal learning, et cetera, the ones in the middle do better. Bring you back to the Paul Andrews notion that what's going on is they're switching into a more careful, deliberate problem-solving kind of mode, as if they had a more complicated problem to solve, because the rats don't know that they can't turn the shock off in the middle. They just think it's a more complex thing, we think. What Mayer's done is mapped out the underlying wiring that's involved. We've got the dorsal raphe, that's where all the cell bodies use serotonin. Serotonin is the 5-HT. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter. Then you've got the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. In rats, that's where it's critical. Within the dorsal raphe, we also have GABA neurons interconnection. GABA are inhibitory. Anytime a GABA neuron fires, anything it synapses with is less likely to fire. From the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, we have a descending pathway, which is glutamatergic. Glutamatergic neurons are excitatory. Anytime a glutamine neuron that uses glutamine as a neurotransmitter fires, it increases the odds that the neurons it synapses with are going to fire. So if you are the rat on the far left and you're exposed to controllable stressors and you can control it, that lights up the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and it sends a impulse down to the dorsal raphe, synapses on a GABA, and basically it turns down the stress response. It's as if your cortex is telling the limbic system, I know it hurts, don't worry, I'm going to turn it off 30 seconds. I got this handled. Okay. If you don't have control in the middle, you don't got that. What Mayer and dragging Marty Seligman along in a marvelous 2016 article. Let's see if I have that. Oh, yeah, just say that Hebb's dictum is that neurons have to fire together to wire together. If you're not getting the beginning of the stress response, the dorsal raphe firing, because the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is suppressing it, then you're not going to put the two together. You may have control, but you're not going to learn that you do. And if you've got medications on board that are keeping the dorsal raphe from firing, you might have the input coming in from ventromedial prefrontal cortex, but they're not going to wire to each other, and you're not going to have that kind of learning going on. So we think, and Mayer thought it was quite a reasonable supposition. We think that what might be going on is that medications on board do suppress symptoms. They do turn down some of this process, which is unpleasant, but they do so in a way that keeps you from learning the life's lessons that you might otherwise have learned if you work your way through the problem. There we go. Final thing I'll show is we have a trial that we want to do that we think will get us at that. Again, we're going to compare cognitive therapy with medication. We want the combined condition in the middle. And this time, we're essentially doing the last study I showed you with the CBT alone condition. We want to see if indeed it's the case that prior exposure to cognitive therapy, the middle row, does worse than folks that had prior exposure to CBT alone, much like Dave Barlow did in his trial. And we're looking to Corey maybe to help us out with that. I stop at this point. I'm going to stop share for a minute and see any things that people want to bring up, any things you guys want to ask. Any, do you guys want to catch your breath? I know I can be a little exhausting.
Hi, Stephen. We have a raised hand from Lewis with a question or comment, and we also have a question in the chat box that we can address later.
Great.
Steve, absolutely wonderful. So fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm wondering, you know, when I look at the model, very persuasive model about the evolutionary perspective or advantages of depression. What would be, you think, the evolutionary advantage of chronic depression? If you believe in that construct, right? So assuming that this exists, what would be the evolutionary perspective advantage on this? And perhaps based on the hypothesis that you came up with, some of the major trials that you would go, what would be the clinical implications of this in terms of the best potential matching treatments of this?
Yeah. Great question. And thanks for that. Number one, it doesn't have to be the case that everybody benefits from an evolved adaptation. So, I mean, appendices still play a function for us. People think it's a vesical, but it turns out the odds are very low. But if you got an appendix, you're less likely to die from a blood-based infection than if you don't. That being said, some people get appendices get infected, and you die a lot faster from that. So the fact that an appendix involved adaptation doesn't mean it works out to your advantage. And it's quite possible that depression could be an evolved adaptation that served our ancestors well for most of them, but for some of them, the thing breaks down, or it goes on too long, or something doesn't turn off the way it should. And that's not to say there may not be an advantage for chronic depression. For God help me, I can't think of one. Because you would think if you thought about, if it helped you ruminate and you're ruminating successfully, you ought to be able to think your way out of the depression. That doesn't seem to happen. But what do we know? There are chronic depressions. About 1 in 5 in a clinical population. These folks have been depressed as long as they can remember. And,
so could this be a disease?
Might be a disease. Keep in mind Wakefield's definition. Any breakdown in an evolved adaptation where it's not functioning the way it's supposed to, if it evolved to get you out of the problem that you were in and it's not doing that, then you got a mechanism that's broken down. And if it doesn't work to your advantage, and being depressed for years at a time may not be to your advantage, then you've got something to fit Wakefield's definition. So chronic depression might be a breakdown. Yeah,
that's why I was thinking about that.
Yep. Well, it's great. So you were 3 steps ahead of me, which is not the first time.
Not sure about that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Next, who's got it?
We have the question in the chat box from Jamie Delgadillo that I'm going to read to you, Stephen. He says that evolutionary scientists posit that some behavioral phenotypes could be understood as 1, adaptations to solve ancestral problems, or 2, byproducts of adaptations, and that you propose a compelling case for depression as an evolved adaptation. but he wonders if either depression or other mental health problems could be second-order byproducts of other evolved adaptations. For example, hallucinations as a less adapted byproduct of the primary adaptive capacity for vivid imagination. If you have any thoughts about this type of interpretation.
Yeah. It's great. Again, another great question. I have some thoughts, and mostly what I've picked up hanging around people that think about these kinds of things. Andrews is not the only evolutionary biologist or evolutionary psychiatrist or psychologist who's been thinking about what function depression might serve. And there are older theories that go on there, John Bowlby's being probably the first that came in, that what we get with depression grows out of our the useful process of having young infants attached to their caregiver. And it may be that stuff that keeps you from wandering off at age 3 that lets you survive may not be all that critical to you at age 30 if you've got a relationship that's breaking up. So some of the other kind of very plausible explanations of the conservation withdrawal notion, that it's almost like a hibernation. If you're in an environment that's not particularly reinforcing, you want to pull in and not expend your resources. There are a couple others as well, and the arguments between evolution and biologists is not is an evolved adaptation, but is what function did it evolve to serve? They're all on the same page. I've not talked to anybody or heard about anybody yet, and we have a group here that got organized at Vanderbilt of people that do, they're evolutionists coming out of neuroscience, et cetera. And it was like I walked down from psychiatry, I'm walking into a whole different world. Everybody in that room is absolutely agreed about how this stuff works. And these things are not diseases, disorders. A lot of medical issues are diseases, disorders, but then they're looking for what the function is. So let me come back to the original part of the question. There was an additional thing that I think I just talked away from. Did I get to the question? Remind me, please, what the question was.
Jamie, I don't know if you can hear us. Oh, there you are. I see you, Jamie. Hi, Jamie. Do you want to turn on your microphone?
Oh, Jamie, hello. How are you?
Hello, Steve. Thanks very much for a wonderful talk. So,
did I butcher your last name earlier?
Yes, fine.
Sorry about that.
So I wondered if there's a third possibility outside of evolved adaptation, disease as in an adaptation that has some kind of dysfunction. And third, which is almost a haphazard emergent byproduct of another primary adaptation, something that is evolved to serve a purpose that happens to have a byproduct that is disadvantageous for the individual, not the lineage.
Yeah. Indeed, I think there is, and another great question. One of the sharpest critics of the evolutionary perspective was the guy at Harvard, and did a lot. I'm going to block on his name right now. Stephen Gould did a lot of writing, and he talked about one of the major critiques of these kinds of arguments, perspectives, is what he called the spandrel article. In Gothic architecture, there are these little buttresses that show up. They serve no functional purpose whatsoever. They were decorative only, but they're there, and they're there, et cetera, et cetera. And he would suggest that some of the things that people are trying to explain away are nothing more than byproducts of things that served other purposes. And it would be, if that's the case, it'd be quite possible for those byproducts to not be useful in and of themselves. You would expect it to work its way out of the gene pool eventually, but not always. And one of the things that folks like Matt Keller address and try to talk about is why it is that disorders that we would think are true diseases that ought to bias against propagation, like schizophrenias, are still around. And there are at least two major explanations there. One is that rates of mutation happen faster than you get bred out of the population. The other is that the genes that are associated with the schizophrenias are associated with things like creativity, and they're offsetting advantages. But any of those kind of things are possible. And again, we're off into brave new worlds, and we're suggesting these folks are suggesting things which are heresy clinically, but there's not a single common theme that runs through all of them. It's a great possibility. Yeah. John, are you up again?
Yes, thank you. The question of chronic depression, I mean, there are numerous things systemically or social psychologically that that could interfere with the useful purpose of ruminating.
Yeah.
For example, diagnostics in themselves. If you tell a person that you have a brain disorder, then you're already detracting from his self-efficacy, for example, and directing him to just try to hang in rather and wait or take medications for life. And then, as you already referred to, possible effects of the medication on the learning itself, the neurology of the learning itself.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yep.
And so there are quite a few things that could interfere with the efficient functioning of that rumination.
Yep. I think it's a great point. One of the things I would share, and I'm not sure how far I want to push this yet, but in the most recent trial that I showed you, where we didn't get the long-term enduring effect, we really had only about 10% of the sample that we started with ended up not recovering. We lost some folks to attrition, but only about 10% didn't recover, and they were really overrepresented folks with chronic depressions. And the folks that we were following the cases, doing supervision on, there was something that I wouldn't necessarily have assumed before, but it was starting to come into focus for me, is these were folks who knew what they could try to do to change their lives and weren't going to do it, were reluctant to do it. And I'd almost say that it's as if they kind of had a potential solution in mind, but they were not going to take the chance. And I don't necessarily see them, the folks who are just clinically depressed. It almost seems to me that, what's the old adage, nothing ventured, nothing gained. If you think there's something that might work you out, if you wanted to see if somebody's interested in you, ask them out. If you want to see if you can get a job, put in the application. At that point, they would see what they might be able to do, and they would hesitate at the brink. And there was nothing had great luck getting them to take that big step. It's like they were not going to take that step into the unknown. The other thing I'll say is that as you guys may not know if it's as bad in Europe and the rest of the world, in the States, we really rely a lot more on antidepressant medications than virtually anywhere else in the world, other than maybe New Zealand, which also has direct-to-consumer advertising. But in the States, most of the prescriptions are being written for SSRIs. They're being written by primary care physicians. And one of the things we do know is if you're going to medicate somebody, for God's sake, dose to remission, and don't be satisfied with the person being better, but keep going until they're as well as they've ever been. And if you can't get them there in about 4 to 6 weeks, then start augmenting or switching medications. And most primary care physicians will put somebody on medications and see them again, maybe 6 months or a year later. And if the person's feeling a bit better, if you take the edge off, that's all the more they do. So I also think that if you look at somebody like Maduka Trivedi's marvelous work with the Texas Medication Algorithm Project, just by those two basic principles, you dose to remission and you augment or switch if you're not getting full remission, and you do measurement-based care, very similar to what Mike Lambert got with his great stuff with the psychotherapies. If you do measurement-based care following good basic principles, he doubled the efficacy of the antidepressant medications. My hunch is we have large cohorts of folks walking around the states that are getting marginally adequate pharmacological treatment. If you're going to treat pharmacologically, at least for God's sake, do it right. And most folks don't do it right or get it done right.
Okay, I think I'm going to dive in here, and not least because my tea's ready. But I think if we can bring this to a close now.
Yeah, and I would guess in England, it must be about time when your cortisol levels are dipping.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's so. So usually 3 people in the yeah, perfect.
Anyway, I want to kind of say personally, professionally, everywhere, and just to thank you, Steve, for an absolutely wonderful presentation webinar, which is exactly what we wanted to kick this off. And you can understand now why, when I asked you, only you could kick off this webinar series, given your longevity of experience with the handbook. But also just reflecting, I think what I've sort of picked up, what I really like from this is just how you've managed to reflect back and see mistakes that have been made and how, kind of that wasn't right, and we can do, so we can always improve and do things better and not get sort of so dogmatic about things. And actually, there's always the possibility that there's a better way or stuff like that. And
quick comment on that if I can. I think
yeah,
that's,
go on.
you guys may not have noticed, but I haven't done it intentionally, but most of the mistakes were mine. And I built an entire career on correcting in the next study what I got wrong in the last one. So
well, we should all take that on board, because I think if you can do that and be open about that, we should all do that. So that's wonderful. So for those folk who are here, if you're unmuted, can you applause? If you're muted, can you just do your clap, fingers, hands, or whatever? But wonderful, Steve. Huge thanks. And I hope we see you in person sometime soon.
you're far too kind. I look forward to the next 7 editions I get to be part of.
Okay, well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you now.